I now have the genuine privilege to welcome two scholars whose work has simply not just contributed to online learning, but has really helped shape how the field understands it. So, Professor Michael Barbour is an internationally recognised as one of the world's leading authorities on K 12 distance, online, and blended learning. He's Assistant Dean for Academic Integration and Innovation and Professor of Instructional Design at Touro University in California. Across almost 3 decades, Michael has worked as a classroom and online teacher, course designer, administrator, evaluator, and researcher, and we wonder why our days are exhausting. His scholarship has been particularly influential on understanding the design, delivery, regulation, and governance of online learning, including its implications for rural and underserved communities. Underserved, not undeserved, sorry. His expertise has been sought by legislative committees, legal proceedings, and education projects across North America, Australasia, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Don't you love people introducing you? You go, oh, actually, I have done a lot of stuff. Professor Charles, or Chuck, because I'm told that only his mother calls him Charles, Hodges is an internationally respected scholar of instructional design, education technology, and online learning. He's Professor of Instructional Technology at Georgia Southern University and has served for approximately a decade as Editor-in-Chief of Tech Trends, one of the leading journals of the Association for Educational Communications and Technology. Chuck's scholarship spans learner motivation, self-efficacy, instructional design and technology, enhanced learning and teaching. He's perhaps most widely known as the lead author of The Difference Between Emergency Remote Teaching and Online Learning, which was a landmark contribution that gave educators around the world a shared language for distinguishing rapid crisis response from thoughtfully designed online education.
Yeah.
Together, Michael and Chuck bring an extraordinary depth of scholarship and practical experience. Their work challenges us to stop treating online learning as an emergency substitute and recognise it as an established educational reality for which every future teacher must be prepared. So please join me in welcoming Professors Michael and Chuck to present Stop Calling It Unprecedented, Reimagining Teacher Prep for the Online Learning Reality that is already here.
All right. Thank you very much, Nicole. So as Nicole mentioned, I'm Mike Barbour, and my colleague here is Chuck Hodges, and we're going to talk to you for, I guess, about 40 minutes or so about a topic, actually, that we've been developing now for some time, probably about 3 or 4 years. So to get us started, I want to sort of take us back 5, 6 years. And we really have to think, it is, I guess, 6 years now. I say 5, 6 years. It has been actually more than 6 years since this happened. And there's a fascinating bit of psychological research that has looked at what they call the COVID time warp. Because during that period, we didn't really have a lot of the in-person type things that we would normally peg events to. So, oh, that was 3 years after X, or, that was just before I did Y. Because we didn't have those things, we really have a hard time trying to distinguish exactly how much time has passed in the time that was recent just before COVID, and then the time that came fairly quickly after COVID. So, but put your thinking hats on, and remember back 6 years and, I guess, 4, 5 months ago, and when basically the world shut down. And when it came to education, this was actually sort of, what, at least here in North America, this was what we saw in a lot of urban and suburban environments for a lot of the teachers that were happening, at least in the immediate aftermath, in that March, April kind of time frame. By the time April, May came around, and then when for us the next school year started in August or September of the following year, we moved into something that looked more like this. And actually, by that point in time, folks had actually started to figure out how to use the electronic whiteboard, or at least some folks may have, but not a lot. You still saw a lot of this a year and two in. And one of the things that this caused, and as Sarah mentioned, it was something that people sort of just threw together. And because of that, I mean, we had all of these different models that were happening, not just in the immediate aftermath of COVID, but in some cases up to 2 school years after COVID hit. And you can see from some of the headlines that you see here, but the number of folks that were ready for this, the what it caused in terms of resignations and burnout. And that's just on the teacher side. When you look on the student side, we had just the same kinds of struggles. One of my favorite things that came out, a colleague of mine actually tweeted this picture over here on the sort of bottom right hand side of these two children, two elementary school children, actually, one in grade 3 and one in grade 5, a brother and sister, who were sitting on the curb outside of a Taco Bell with their little Chromebooks there because that was the only place or the closest place to where they lived where they could actually get internet access. And you can see the Taco Bell employees out there, just trying to make sure they're okay and stuff like that. So when you think about where we came from, this is what for most teachers were their introduction to distance ed, unfortunately. And, as we've noted, it's not necessarily the best introduction.
Okay, and still kind of transforming back to those early days of the pandemic. Um, Myself and some colleagues here on this paper, this is the famous paper for me. Um, we were talking in those early days when people were starting to shut down, talking about shutting down schools, universities. We were all chatting on Twitter at the time, and this collection of authors, we had been involved with online education, distance education in various ways. We got a faculty development person, we got researchers, we got somebody who'd kind of done both. And we were panicked because we were so afraid this was going to happen so fast. And we thought, we know it's going to happen. It's not really going to be that great. And people are going to get burned on it. And in a year, 2 years, people are going to say, well, online learning just doesn't work. So we wrote this paper um, to kind of try to bring that language and that idea into the field. EDUCAUSE published it. They were a great publishing partner. It was open access and they had huge distribution, so it got out really quickly. And shortly after this was published, I think it came out near the end of March, yeah, March 27th, 2020. Michael, of course, he and I have been friends for a while, he contacted me and said, you know what, we need to rework this into a K-12 version because EDUCAUSE is mostly a higher education audience. And Michael's idea was great. He had, a couple of other friends of his, Randy and Kevin, and the rest of us kind of joined him to rework it and just include a context of K-12. All the basic principles and ideas that we discussed in it were uh, transferred quite well, but we did need to kind of get it out to that separate audience because a lot of times the higher ed audience and the K-12 audience for teachers and online learning um, don't go as well. Um, so in that paper, we basically take online learning and contrast it with emergency remote teaching, was what the paper was about. But just to recap, and I know most of the people here listening this morning, this evening, tonight, wherever you happen to be, know this. Online learning is about planning, pedagogy tools, and people. Sarah was a great setup for this talk because she talked about a lot of these same things. And online learning involves systematic planning, pedagogy that you have to fit into the medium that you're using, a purposeful selection of the tools that you want, and teacher readiness, if we're talking about K-12 online learning. So let's look at each of these in just a little bit more detail. So the systematic planning, use a structured model to help you. If you're doing online learning, you have to have some type of structure to help you plan it, develop it, evaluate it, implement it. So this is, online learning. And you also match your instructional strategies to the affordances and constraints of the delivery format. There are, as Sarah mentioned, there's apples and oranges. There's some things that translate across, there's some things that you can do in one delivery mode and not the other. So in online learning, you're aware of that context. You also should pick tools that build on those strengths of the online delivery. You shouldn't, try to do it with things that aren't going to work really well. And then, of course, and this is the real focus of our talk this evening, is teacher readiness and how they need to have good training in how to use the tools of the trade for online learning and also understand kind of the psychology and pedagogy involved of online learning. Um, so to contrast that with emergency remote teaching, which is what we were doing in the early days of the pandemic and following, you know, whereas before you had careful planning, now we have this temporary shift in the midst of some crisis. And Michael's going to talk tonight about some different examples because it didn't all go away when the pandemic eased up. Um, Fully remote teaching, everything was forced on the computer. Regardless of how prepared someone was to teach in that format, they had to go online in most cases, a week or two. And that was, they had to move their classes online, ready to go. And the plan for this emergency remote teaching is it's not going to be permanent. It's going to last during the crisis, and then they're going to go back to what they were doing before. Um, so, it's not really set up to be this permanent thing. So maybe the planning is a little less. Maybe in that case, it was early in the pandemic. And, the primary objective of this emergency remote teaching is to be able to deliver something to keep continuity of instruction during the crisis. And that's the plan there. So to go back. I think
So
Michael picked it up
essentially
here.
what we're looking at is really, in all honesty, and this is a chart that was developed here in North America, but I suspect that it will speak to just about everyone's experiences. What we have is, that phase one is like that, oh crap, what am I going to do kind of moment. That's the let's, use the chalk on the pavement, let's stand outside someone's, what we would call barn door and with the whiteboard on my knee type thing. That phase two, that was when we started to actually, okay, how can we start to use some of these tools in order to really figure out how to do this. Phase three was what should have happened, at least in North America, in the fall of 2020 when we came back for the first full school year. Because, for us, we had 2.5 months from the end of the previous school year to actually plan for, like, how are we going to get ready for this, because we might not be able to go back to school, and if we do, how do we go about doing this. And then when we got to, phase four, that's really what we're looking for. And in all honesty, having, done this type of thing in many jurisdictions all around the world, I can honestly say, while many teachers and many school districts will say that they actually made it to phase four, I've yet to see anyone who actually made it to phase four. Because phase four is basically the kind of environment where you could be in the classroom on a Friday afternoon and the principal comes up on the PA system before you leave at the end of the day and says, because of X or Y, we are going to shift to remote learning starting Monday morning. And Monday morning, when school starts up again in a remote fashion, there is no loss in the quality of instruction that's provided or the continuity of learning that occurs. And I have not seen a single jurisdiction that has done that. And it's interesting because when you look at the history of primary and secondary school sector or K-12 distance learning, it's not like we haven't been doing this for a long time. Sarah mentioned that, we've been doing this for decades. And as you can see, the first correspondence programs began in Canada in 1906. The first educational radio programs began in the US in 29. We saw the advent of instructional television in 61. Telematics, which was used extensively throughout Australia. was introduced in the early 1980s. And, then we move into online learning, which at least at the K-12 level, most folks can peg in North America is starting around 91. And this is a common trajectory that we find because, I look at the School of Isolated and Distance Learning in Western Australia. They're 108 years old this year, which basically means they started in 1908. The School of the Air in Alice Springs is 56 years old this year. All right. So, I mean, when you look at when some of these events are happening here, the Australian context is similar to what we're seeing here in the North American context. And when we look at the pre-pandemic state of online learning, at least in the United States, we had almost every single state that had some form of either full-time or supplemental online learning that were being provided. And I mean, while the number of full-time participants usually ended up in the 1 to 2% of the students, we had in some cases as many as 3 and 5% of students that were engaged in supplemental online learning, where they were in a brick and mortar school and taking one or more classes online to supplement what they couldn't get in the classroom. And this is data that's coming from the Snapshot series, which is a research study that they produce every 2 years in the US by John Watson is the main person behind this for the digital learning community. One that I've been involved in for the last 18 years now. We're actually just getting ready to start up our 19th year. The State of the Nation report, which looks at essentially the same thing in Canada. And you can see that the year before the pandemic happened, we had in some jurisdictions as many as 1 out of every 10 students who were already taking an online course. So this wasn't something that was obscure and something that, only students in really small and remote schools did. This was something that was pretty mainstream in many of the Canadian provinces. Similarly, we've been looking at the same thing in New Zealand. And if you look at the year before the pandemic hit in New Zealand, in some cases, like as you can see here, they had 7% of all, actually a little bit better, 7.5% of all K-12 students or all school sector students were engaged in distance learning prior to the pandemic. In fact, the Takura, which is the correspondence school there, they were actually operating in almost 2/3 of the schools in the country. So again, this is not something that was obscure that folks didn't know about. And, it's not like, even the notion that we might have to shut down for a pandemic should have been a new or novel idea. Pandemics happen and they happen more than you think. If you look at this chart as an example, you can see here are some of the major pandemics that have happened basically in the last 2 millennia. And one of the things that you'll see is that in the first millennia, they tend to happen every 200 to 300 years, these major, global pandemics. When you get into the beginning part of the second millennia, they tend to happen every 100 to 200 years. If you look at the last really 200 to 250 years, you're now starting to see between 2 and 3 happening every century. If you look at where the year 2000 hits there, and if you count the number of pandemics that you see below the 2000 line, you will see that as of right now, we've actually had 5 so far this century, which means if we keep at this pace, unless someone's retiring next year, you're probably going to have to shut down at some point because of a pandemic in the future. If you're at the beginning of your career and you've got another 20 or 30 years left in it, because I know in North America that tends to be about the length of time for a K-12 career for folks that stay in the field, you're going to see another 4 or 5 of these things hit you. And, we've seen this thing happen before. And when we look at the alternative that happens, so here's an example from my home province of Newfoundland and Labrador. This is a school log from Cooley's Point. If you're wondering much about Cooley's Point, it's a little tiny community, it's out on the coast because, well, Newfoundland is an island, so pretty much everything is a coast. To give you some context, if you're at least for the Australians in the audience, and I know I've got some Canadians and Americans in the audience as well, but it's kind of like Laverton. And if you don't know where Laverton is, if you're in Perth, you drive 6 hours along the Great Eastern Highway, and then when you get to Coolgardard, or Coolgardie, sorry, trying to get these right, Coolgardie. You then turn north and drive for another 4 hours along the Goldfield Highway. Then you'll be in Laverton, little community of about 600 or 900 people, single industry kind of place in the middle of nowhere. That's kind of like Cooley's Point. And if you look at the Spanish flu and that, hit in 1918, 1919, essentially they had to close the school there for roughly 13 and a half weeks because, they had no continuity of learning whatsoever. But distance learning um, is, the something that wasn't widely available at this point in time. Um, Interestingly enough, in the US, again, moving from a little tiny community in coastal Newfoundland to Los Angeles, which even back in when the Spanish flu hit was, nice metropolitan area at that point in time, they actually used telephone technology to actually connect with students throughout the Spanish flu. And at the time, the telephone was actually only about 40 years old. And if you think about it, when our pandemic hit, online learning was only about 30 to 35 years old at that point in time. And I know those are sort of trite historical examples, but if you guys look across the Tasman, when New Zealand was hit with the polio epidemic shortly after World War II, the correspondence school they basically would mail kits out to everyone. They also used educational radio to broadcast lessons out to students. They went the same sort of way in the Christchurch area immediately following the earthquakes that happened in 2010 and 2011. One in September, one in February, which basically sort of, if you've been to Christchurch around that time, and I actually showed up 3 weeks after the second earthquake to do my sabbatical over there. The city was pretty much destroyed. The entire city center was red stickered. And, so they moved to an online format for the most part to be able to accommodate those types of things. Looking north from where many of you are right now, we have a lot of the Asian nations that needed to shut down either during SARS or the H1N1 outbreaks and move to an online teaching environment. And that wasn't just in these small, really connected Asian nations. We saw the same thing happen in Bolivia, which is, an underdeveloped Central American, South American country that moved in the same way. And this is one of the things I always find fascinating. And I didn't realize that I had actually read. One of my former students actually found this and showed it to me at one point. But apparently, 10 years before the pandemic, I was talking about how in Singapore they used to shut down the school system and have these e-learning drills so that they could prepare for this kind of thing back in as early as 2010. So these are the types of things that we had going on at the time. And the reason we needed to do these kinds of things, because if you look at the statistics around the number of teachers that were actually prepared for this kind of thing, Catherine Kennedy and Leanne Archambault, basically roughly a decade before the pandemic, did a survey. It was published 8 years before the pandemic, obviously. They surveyed something like 1,300 teacher education programs in the United States and found 1.3% of them actually prepared students for online, pre-service teachers for online learning. 5 years ago, which would have, the data would have been, 5 years later, so the data would have been collected in 2015. The study was published in 2016. Leanna, Catherine, and a couple of other colleagues basically found at that point in time, I think it were 1,600 universities that they reached out to at that point, and it was up to 4.1%. Right, so less than one out of every 20 teachers were exposed or had the opportunity to be exposed to this kind of environment. So this is sort of the context which led to what Chuck and I have been developing here, and I'll turn it back over to Chuck to continue.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. It has been fascinating working on this kind of concept and reading back through old journals, newspapers, magazines to find all of these examples. And I encourage you, if anybody here, I know this is an online teaching conference, if anybody here is an ed tech person, that looking at the new shiny thing is fun, but it's just as fun to me to look back at the history and how things happened. And um, so we had been obviously working on this since the early days of the pandemic, and there was a call for a special issue of a journal. It's JTATE, the Journal of Technology and Teacher Education, which is a journal from the Society for Information Technology and Teacher Education, which they drop one of the T's. It's just CITE. Um, it's a big conference for school-based educational technologies, basically. And Michael and I were talking about, okay, this special issue of the journal is supposed to be an envisioning for what would things be like in 5 years. So we hooked up with another friend of ours, Rick Ferdig. He's at he's at Kent State in
Yep.
Ohio in the U.S. Big online learning guy, well known. And we just were kind of um, brainstorming about, okay, look what has happened. We know teachers in mass are not prepared for online teaching. That's been pretty well documented up to that point with like the Kennedy and Archambault survey and others. We know that this isn't a one-time problem because if you look to the past, this has had to happen. Maybe not on the same global scale like that COVID-19, but in large scale problems that we've needed to solve. So we thought, okay, how are we going to fix this? And we wrote this paper. It's at open access. You can scan the QR code there if you want to, where we came up with objectives that we think, if implemented in teacher education, would help us avoid the shock of emergency remote teaching, if and when it's needed again. And it's more like a when, not an if. And we've been working on this. We have a timeline of our journal articles or publications. Michael and I have done um, it's almost like we're this traveling roadshow, but it's only in Zoom, uh, where we have published, presented, talked about all of this stuff since 2022. If you click this link, or if you well, you can't click it, but if you follow this link, which the slides will be available later, you can kind of see, a bibliography of our work from 2022 on through, where we've been expanding these ideas, getting them out to different audiences because we feel it's one of those things that we can't tell enough people about the need for this. There's a severe kind of a disconnect between academic research and policy. So we're kind of trying to blanket the place. So
It appears, have we
I
lost?
dropped out of there for a minute.
Okay.
Am I back? I have no idea why. Okay, so we're back to our objectives. And again, read some of the articles we published, but we can go over them here. Objective one is there must be sufficient coursework to give pre-service teachers access to the knowledge, skills, and attitudes about K-12 online learning. We picked the word sufficient on purpose because at least in the US, and that's where I live, I admit that's my one of my failings is not enough global experience, but at least in the US, uh, teacher ed curriculum is packed, and there's not a lot of room to do extra. So we didn't want to say they need to have a class, they need to have 3 classes or whatever. We went with sufficient to give some padding there, but we do feel that they need the coursework. There's been a movement in the US for several years now to remove a standalone ed tech class, much less an online learning class, to remove those classes from the required curriculum. And they just want to sprinkle in some of these topics in the other classes. And if that was done with fidelity, maybe it would work, okay? But what they don't get often in those cases is they don't get to hear from us, from experts in this particular field of online learning. So what we would prefer is that they actually take some coursework from professionals in K-12 online learning so that they get the accurate, up-to-date knowledge of what's happening in the field at the time. There's various things. I've seen this handled with badging initiatives in various colleges if they don't have room for a class. Some places might work part of it into another class, so maybe it's a split class, but there needs to be some sufficient coursework. They need to have that. Now, our next objective, teacher candidates should have experiences as online learners. And I really clearly noticed Sarah mentioning this in her opening remarks. There are various reasons for this, but a big reason is that if these teachers are experiencing being online learners themselves, they're going to have this empathy and better understanding for basics like navigation in an online learning system. What can be done? What's easy to do? What's hard to do? And it's just going to give them that different perspective. It's easy to be on the side of the professor, making the assignments, asking people to do things, but this would force them to actually experience that themselves. And we felt pretty strongly that that was necessary. It doesn't have to be an online learning class about online learning, but I guess if you wanted to try to kill two birds with one stone, I guess you could do that. So our third objective, we want these teacher education programs, that's TEP. We want these teacher education programs to include field experiences in online and blended learning. So, objective 2, the pre-service teachers are simply online learners. They're experiencing online learning to see what their students might see. Here, they're actually, here in the States, we call it student teaching a lot of times. They're clinical, practical experiences or field experiences. And that's what we think they should be having. They already have them in the face-to-face programs. They need to be doing something similar. Now, again, the length of that could maybe be in question. I mean, we usually have student teachers do a 12 to 15 week or maybe 2 of those in student teaching. There's probably not room for them to do 12 to 15 weeks field experiences in online learning, but they need to have some experience actually working with a mentor teacher who can help them learn how to be an online teacher. There is still I still run into people all the time who tell me I teach fully online. They'll say, well, you're not really teaching. That's virtual teaching or something like that. So we need to have our teachers understand through a lived experience with a qualified mentor to understand it is teaching. It's just a little different. What are you doing when you're doing those teachings? Our next objective, objective 4, and this one is kind of researcher centric, but it's needed for everything to work together. And that is, we need instruments. We could either refine existing ones or we need to create solid ones, new ones that support the growth of pre-service teachers in their online learning skills. There are some instruments around, there are some frameworks, but there aren't enough, and many of the ones that exist weren't really research-based and validated in ways that would make for good kind of learning science to build off of. So, you know, any researcher, any professor, they're going to start asking you questions like, well, how do you define that? How do you measure that? And this objective is all about that. We need to come up with the metrics and instruments that will support us in a systematic way, developing pre-service teachers to be able to work in this online environment. Uh, our next objective, objective 5, has to do with the standards. And again, that is kind of this research-centric thing that the researchers could help develop these, get them validated with research and practice partnerships. And that way we know what the teachers need to be, what these pre-service teachers need to be learning. If we just let everybody kind of decide what they need to learn, then nobody's going to kind of have this nice solid foundation that they can work from. So we need to have a nice set of standards developed with systematic research and then validated through more research that says this is what K-12 teachers need to know. And then we can use that to build the curriculum, the field experiences, and whatnot that they need to be successful. The final objective, and I suspect, although I don't know, but I suspect this is the case in many different governments, many different countries. There's a lot of things that would be nice to do. There's a lot of things we should do, but nice and should don't often translate into actual practice. And, Michael went through slides before saying, well, we know that teachers aren't well prepared. We know that kind of online learning, the emergency remote teaching during the pandemic was not a success for many reasons. In many cases, it wasn't a success. Kind of history tells us we're going to need to do this some more. We're probably going to be switching to remote schools, maybe not globally, but on a large scale. And we still haven't come out of the pandemic saying, yes, this is something everybody needs to learn. This is something we're going to make them all learn it. One of my biggest fears in those early days of the pandemic was, are we going to learn from this, or are we just going to want to forget about it when it's over and just go back to usual? And I think, I don't know. I don't know your experience, but my experience at least has been a lot of people just want to forget about it and go back to 2019 days. So if we don't have our accrediting bodies, our state agencies, whatever type of governmental influence there is over teacher education, if we don't have them saying, yes, if you're going to have an approved teacher education program, you're going to be having them be online learners. You're going to have them have field experiences online learning. You're going to have them take a course in how to teach online. If we don't have those required by whatever body does the requiring, it's probably not going to happen in most cases. And yes, this is a hard sell because nobody likes governmental control. Nobody likes kind of unfunded mandates because that kind of thing happens. And at least in the US, if we had these requirements in place, there are things we would have to figure out how to do differently in our teacher education program. They're very full. The curriculum is busy. The students, spend 4 years becoming teachers, and that would be hard work to fit that stuff in. But we think that it's important enough that this final objective is, yes, make it happen. We can talk all day about what we need to do, what we should do, but we need to have somebody step in and say, yes, this is important and we need to do it.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. And it's important to remember that, these 6 objectives came out of this notion in 2022, so early in the pandemic. I mean, basically, we were just, at least in North America, there were some jurisdictions that were still engaged in remote learning. There were some jurisdictions that had just come out of remote learning. And the task for us was something that could conceivably be done by the year 2025. So essentially in 3 years, or essentially last year, if you want to put it in sort of where we are now, to get to a point where we were in phase 4 all the time on this chart, so that basically teachers, regardless of where they were located, regardless of their circumstances, were able to basically switch back and forth, to toggle essentially back from online or distance into the classroom with complete ease, if you will. And it's interesting because, we've talked a lot about this from, the perspective of the pandemic. And I know for at least my Australians in the audience, this is, going to be a reference that probably isn't a personal one, but for the North Americans in the audience, at least ones north of the Mason-Dixon line, although apparently once it did happen here in California in my neck of the woods back in 1999, because everyone talks about it, but schools closed for a variety of reasons. And over here, snowstorms tend to be one of the more common ones for these short-term closures. And we've been talking about, these types of short-term closures for a very long time. And it's not just ones that we have consistently seen historically, but if you start looking at, the types of things that are happening in the world today, every single headline you're going to see here is a post-pandemic headline. Right? So these are types of things that have caused schools to close, in some cases for an extended period of time, since the pandemic. Toilets backing up. Who had that on their bingo card in the UK as we were going? Snowstorms, as you can see there, hurricanes, heat waves, wildfire smoke from a neighboring country, which apparently we're going to get tariffed for now because, the American president wants the tariffs. Snow in Athens. So, I mean, if it can snow in Athens, maybe it can snow in your neck of the woods in Australia one of these days as well, because as we all know, our climate is changing. Again, air quality here. I don't know what the African one there is, the UNICEF one, why they closed there. Flooding over across the Tasman up in the Auckland areas, extreme weather being the major factor. And, these types of things are not only happening more, but they're happening more frequently. Right. And, if we had started to look, and Chuck and I have actually done this, trying to find examples of headlines like this pre-pandemic, and there are some, but not the wealth of ones that we see post-pandemic. And that tells me, that the types of things that are happening, from natural disasters to weather events, they are more severe in nature and more frequent in nature, which is why the type of stuff that we're talking about here really has to happen, because, this is actually another EDUCAUSE article that Chuck found, and the slides will be available afterwards so you can read what's there. And I wanted to put it all there on the slide so you had access to it. But in particular, I wanted to use the term, this idea of polycrisis. Essentially, when you have all of these different crises that are happening in different jurisdictions, and the end result ends up being the same, regardless of what the crisis is or where it's happening. It's a disruption to society in some way, shape, or form. Be it having to, close schools, to being it, having society shut down. And I see in the chat, war and displacement is actually a great example. If you think about, students in country escaping me now. Kiev is its capital.
Ukraine.
Ukraine. Thank you. I don't know why that wasn't coming right off my tongue, but I appreciate that. You think about kids in Ukraine and how many of them haven't stepped foot inside of a school building now for in some cases years. Right. And, so these types of things are happening. They're happening a lot more. And you would think that even just the pandemic would have been something that would have made a jump in this. But, if you look at, Leanne and her colleagues, and Lauren Wu is actually one of Leanne's doctoral students, she essentially did that same study that Leanne and Catherine had done in 2010 and in 2015. So she did it in 2023, 24. And while there's a great improvement because we went from 1.3 to 4.1 to now we're up to 14%, but 14% still means roughly 1 out of every 24 teachers have the opportunity. Not actually do it, just are provided the opportunity. She didn't measure how many students actually took advantage of that opportunity, but only 1 out of every 23 even had the opportunity. So we can't afford to forget not just the lessons of 2020, but I mean, as you saw from going back to, the Spanish flu, these are lessons that we keep seeing again and again and again and again. Right. And so we need to actually start doing these kinds of things because worst case scenario, we prepare our teachers and our students to be able to operate in a digital world because let's face it, many of them when they go into the workforce or when they go into post-secondary environment are going to be exposed to online learning and digital learning anyway. So teaching them how to learn in that environment when they're still in the K-12 system is important, but also the ability to account for all of these other things that are happening. And that's the really important thing that we want to sort of underscore. So we've got, I think, about 5 or 6 minutes for questions before we've got our break. So I'm just going to go to my last slide here because it's got our how you can get a hold of us. And I'll drop this into the chat. And I see Chuck has already dropped his email address into the chat. And like I say, the slides will be available following it, and we welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Mike and Chuck. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to be able to ask while we have these guys here?
I'd like to ask a question, if that's okay. So I didn't know how to raise my hand. I'm not a Zoom person, I'm a Teams person. Anyway, thank you, Michael and Chuck. That was fascinating, and I really like the lessons learned. I mean, we really do need to look behind us to be able to move in front of us. I really want to unpack this sufficient idea. How do we even consider sufficient? My concern is that exactly what you said, Chuck, about the deep understanding of online pedagogy, if that's shifted to a discipline specific subject such in teacher education such as history or maths or English, how do we build in capability of our academic staff to be able to leverage up the deeper understandings of how to teach online in those? I get it, it's important to actually put it within a discipline, but how do we ensure that this kind of notion about the rethinking, the reforming of the pedagogy is enabled because we could deliver what is good pedagogy online through the discipline, but how do we actually do the shifting? Because a lot of pre-service teachers come, as you both know, with a lot of history of teaching from an experience in a classroom base. So it's the unpacking that we actually have to do as well. So I know that's a really complex question, but I just like your insights into that idea for teacher education.
I'm going to start if it's okay, Michael.
All right.
The word sufficient was carefully chosen when Michael and Rick and I were writing that article because we weren't sure, you know, maybe an institution could do it well with one course. Maybe somebody else might do two courses. And we knew we couldn't pick the right number. We also knew if we said a hard number, there would be a lot of pushback on that. So we thought the use of the word sufficient would make it sound, would give people some flexibility to say, okay, we have to have some coursework on this. What's going to work for us? Because frankly, the way things are going now, anything would be better than the nothing that they're getting. So we were kind of hoping, this would encourage people to actually offer some coursework.
And I think jurisdictions matter as well in this, and that's another reason why we chose sufficient. But I mean, you've asked the million-dollar question basically, because, and it's the same question we've been asking about the integration of technology since, the late 70s, early 80s. Then and Chuck had mentioned, there's sort of two philosophies around that. Do you provide these standalone course or courses that teach you how to do it, or do you use what at least the National Education Technology Plan in the United States refers to as program wide, program deep, where it's not a standalone course, but it is immersed throughout the curriculum and all of the faculty are doing it. But I mean, let's face it, I mean, we've all gone through a teacher education program here. How many of you had the faculty that were capable of a program-wide, program-deep approach to effective technology integration in the instruction that you received while you were in uni? All right, so I mean, that's really the catch-22, because the program-wide, program-deep approach is the much better approach. The problem is that the vast majority of faculty just don't have the understanding and background for that. And I started off by saying the jurisdictional things, because like if I look at a jurisdiction like Florida, where they've had a very robust virtual school now for 3 decades. I mean, the Florida Virtual School was created in 1999, 96, 97. So they're they've been operating now for 3 decades. And on average, roughly 1 out of every 3 students will have taken a course from the Florida Virtual by the time they graduate high school. You've got states like Michigan where online, and Canadian provinces like Ontario, where online learning is required in order to graduate from high school. In jurisdictions like that, because the students are coming out, they have these experiences. In the case of Ontario, they got to have 2 courses that were taught in an online environment in order to graduate from high school. A prospective teacher who comes through that requirement probably needs a little bit less when it comes to sufficiency, because they've had the experience of being an online learner. They've had a lot of the things that we're already recommending. So I think that's the crux of it. And it does vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
Michael reminded me of this phrase, program wide and program deep, this evening. And the current presidential administration in the US basically kind of threw out a lot of these things, like as in into the trash bin. But this phrase, program wide and program deep, was used, like Michael said, in our National Educational Technology Plan, at least a few iterations of the plan. And what they meant by that, if you haven't quite caught up with the meaning, is they wanted to have educational technology be offered in teacher education programs, what they said program wide. So that would be in multiple courses, and program deep, but they never really defined this. And a lot of people stopped with the first half, and they went program wide, we'll offer it across these courses and be done. But the program deep part to me was the coursework from the educational technology online learning professionals who know the current research and how it should all be implemented. And that's kind of, to me, if it was sufficient, it would be program wide and program deep. You would see people in your discipline methods courses using it in meaningful ways. Now we can talk about how they get that training, and that's another talk. But they also should have, at least a course from people who actually know about online learning. So
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And Sarah, what a great question. And I'm really glad you didn't ask that of me, I'll tell you. That's absolutely fabulous. And I just want to say thank you so much to Michael and to Chuck, and also to Sarah for presenting for us this morning. I feel like that has set us up so well for today. I know that my mind is already going. Our Australian Professional Standards for Teachers are being rewritten at the moment for our teacher education, and I know it'd be great to have some online learning APSTs in there, which I think would be fantastic. So made my mind start whirling around. What we're going to do now is we're going to have a very short movement break. As Katie keeps reminding us, we are mammals and mammals need to move. So if you would like to have a quick comfort break or would like to move, and then what's going to happen after this is if you've all got your program, and I know that I think Asada or Katie is about to pop a link to it back up in the chat. You will have, we've got 4 concurrent sessions or streams that are starting at 10 o'clock. All you need to do is click on the link to the one that you are interested in going to. And if you would like to pop between them, please feel free. We will make sure that we stick to time. And you can, of course, pop into whichever one you would like. I know there's such great sessions that you're going to want to go to all of them or at least 2 at a time. But thankfully, we're recording them also. Of course, you can go and watch them all later on. But go and have a quick break, and we will see you in one of the 4 streams in 5 minutes. Thank you so much.